Alright, welcome back everybody. I've got a slightly different type of video for y'all today. I try to read all of my comments and I've seen a lot of requests for tutorials or to explain why I do things in a certain way, but honestly I don't think I could make an informative enough tutorial compared to the ones that are already on the platform, whether it's for stick figures or just animation in general. So instead of that, I decided to try doing post commentary over one of my own time lapses so I could explain my process and answer a bunch of questions I've seen brought up a lot. Since I've never made a video like this before, I'd appreciate if you guys could give me some feedback on it. So I guess just leave a like on the video or comment on if you want more videos like these and if you prefer time lapses with either less or no commentary. As of recently, we've had a lot of newcomers to the channel, but the people that have been around a little bit longer know that I've animated a spar between Ryan and Zen before. Since I made a few changes to both of their designs, I wanted to animate a rematch between them and added a few other characters that my friends own in the background that you'll see when the full animation comes out. If you guys follow me on Twitter, you've probably seen that already, since that's usually where I post all of my work in progress clips. Since I had them standing so far apart at the beginning, Zen's first attack was a dashing low sword sweep that she used to close the distance between them. It's important to keep track of the momentum a dash like that would carry, since she has to ease out of it rather than immediately coming to a stop when her attack ends and before it can transition into the next one. Once I laid out what's the general movement gonna look like, I went back and adjusted the spacing between the frames so the dash would look a little bit more natural, which you're gonna see a lot of in this video. This next part isn't necessary for you guys, but for the overhead swing that she's about to do, I decided to remove the head and the offhand stick that isn't holding the sword, just so there's nothing in the way while I animate the body, since most of the time the body is what drives the action. Bending the torso as she prepares for the swing adds some exaggeration to the pose to make the swing look more powerful, and obviously, at least one of the feet need to be planted to help with positioning. I add the other arm and the head back after that, and add a few more frames to the wind up so when the sword eventually does come down, it looks like there's more force behind it. Most of the time, since I usually animate straight ahead instead of pose to pose, which for those who don't know just means animating each frame continuously instead of making the key poses first and then filling in the in-betweens later, I struggle to visualize the movements of each limb when they all happen at the same time. Splitting them up and using the body that drives the action first helps me with that. It's not that animating with pose to pose is worse or more difficult, and I know a lot of animators that either prefer to use it or use both. It's just how I'm personally more comfortable animating, so you guys can experiment a little bit and choose whichever works best for you. I think from this point forward I continue to use this method, but I cut out the sections where I add the other limbs from the video, just because I don't think it's really necessary to see in most cases or it won't teach you guys anything. There is one point a little later down the line where I do keep it in the video, and when it gets to that point I'll point it out and explain why it's there. Her last attack in this sequence is going to be a more horizontal slash, so once Zen's lean from the previous move is over, she stands up as she winds the sword back again. For each of these moves I've had her step into the attack as it comes out, which is another way of adding more force to her swings. As she leans into this swing, I mess with the segment length of the arm holding the sword because it's seen at a different angle as it rotates around her body. If you're going to do it this way, just be mindful about returning it to the original length or else it's going to look like unintentional resizing. Now right here, I see a lot of people asking why I animate one character first and then switch to the next instead of animating them both at the same time. This is just another personal preference thing, and I do it because it's easier for me to animate a sequence of reactions once I know the timing and spacing of whatever they're reacting to. That way, I know where a character either should or shouldn't be, in this case in relation to Zen and her sword attacks. In a few instances, it's meant that I didn't have to reanimate an entire section because I accidentally made them too close to each other and couldn't have the secondary character move out of the way in time. Ryan needs to back up and raise his front leg to avoid the low sweep that Zen does here, and as you can see I mapped out the sword path with a few curved red segments just so I know how far back I need him to be. Since Zen is going to continue advancing and I want Ryan to keep dodging these first few attacks rather than block them, he's going to continue to back up once he stabilizes himself. Around here is where Rai finishes reacting to the first attack and begins dodging the second. Since this next attack is completely vertical, I thought it would be more interesting to have him slightly pivot towards the camera to dodge in front of it rather than just backing up to avoid it again. Even though it could still potentially work the way I had it, you can see from the onion skin it still looks like he's getting caught in the sword's path and would end up getting tagged. I wasn't happy with how this looked, so off camera I slightly adjusted the arc to make it clear that he's dodging the sword rather than it phasing through him. Again, the black circle that's there is just a guide for myself about the arc the sword is traveling in. I prefer doing it that way instead of adding the effects to the swing first, just for instances like this where I end up having to change things around. Since the next swing comes out pretty quickly, he begins preparing for his next dodge while still backing up from the last. This time he's turning his body away from both Zen and the camera while he ducks under the swing. It'll be a little more apparent that he's turning once I add the arms to the torso, because then you'll be able to make out where his shoulders are. That's why you'll see in a few seconds that I have Rai's pivoting foot cut slightly below the guidance line I have on the floor, since his heel is spinning towards the camera. It's the same reason I make some of his limbs stretch or shrink here, since they would appear longer or shorter from the camera's perspective. But again, for anybody animating this way, it's important not to overdo it or leave the limbs at a different length than how they started unless your character can actually change their proportions. I wouldn't recommend this for any new animator because it's a pretty easy and common mistake to make at any skill level if you haven't been made aware of it. Once I had the kick pose ready, I went back to animate the arms, and this is where I was talking about leaving it in the video earlier. It's hopefully easier now for you guys to see the direction his body is turning in, but he's also going to be putting his hands on the ground as he throws out his kick. His hand acts as a pivot point and stabilize his body because without them he'd be kicking with an off-balance center of gravity. Realistically, he'd probably fall without his arms there, but they also help show that he's throwing his body weight into the kick, which would make it look more powerful. Since he continues to rotate after the kick, his arms will come off the ground as his torso shifts. Another question a lot of you guys ask me is how do I come up with different poses in my choreography, and honestly I found it to be a lot easier when I started using references for poses. I strongly recommend using them for how useful they are, and because you can find them literally anywhere, like Google Images, Pinterest, or even use yourself as a reference. This is a little bit of a rant, but if you claim to be using something as a reference, just be honest if that's actually what you were doing, because there's a big difference between using something as a reference to learn and copying a scene from some professional animator while claiming it as your own, and in some cases even profiting off it. There's nothing wrong with analyzing someone else's work to help improve as an animator, but you shouldn't pretend that you created it yourself. I say all of that just to say that it is completely fine using genuine references to help you learn as an animator, and it will only help you become better. The two kicks Rai does here, for example, were referenced from some YouTube videos of real instructors depicting different martial arts, but you can use whatever works for you. Right now I have Rai using the momentum from his first kick, and continuing to spin, he does a sweeping kick at where Zen's feet are going to be. Even using a reference, animating turning bodies with stick figures is pretty difficult for me to visualize, so I made another arc that Rai's kick will travel along as he transitions from the sweep kick back into the crouching pose that he started in. By this point, Rai's recovered from his sweep kick, but he continues his spin again as he prepares to jump into the air. To make the jump have a convincing amount of force behind it, I add anticipation by animating him crouch low to the ground for a few frames before springing up in the direction of his jump, which I then transition into a spinning midair kick. For the path of his jump to look realistic once he's in the air, the amount he moves up each frame needs to decrease until he reaches the peak of the jump. From there, he starts to fall back to the ground because of gravity. The black line I have there isn't for the peak of his jump, it's just a guideline for Zen's standing height, so I know roughly where he needs to be kicking so that the space lines up when I animate her reactions. The kick pose I have Rai in here used one of Goku's moves from Dragon Ball FighterZ as a reference, so again you can use literally anything from a reference as long as it's somewhat accurate. I didn't use a reference for the follow through after the kick, so I moved the extra limbs out of the way to make it easier for me to see where his body needs to be by the time he hit the ground, and then I went back later to add them in. After making a few adjustments, I positioned him for his last kick, which is going to follow the arc I set out for his leg before he can go back to a standing position and I can animate Zen's reactions. Rai's going to be kicking with the leg that isn't currently on the ground, so it needs to spin again with the rest of his body and then be brought into position for it to flow into the guidelines I left for myself earlier. Now we're back to animating Zen for the last segment of the video, with her first reaction being to duck her head down under Rai's counter kick from earlier. Since the sweep kick is coming up next, she needs to lean in and crouch to anticipate the jump she's going to do to avoid it. It's important, again, to keep spacing in mind because if she backs up too far, she'll be out of the range of the sweep kick and there wouldn't be a point in her jumping backwards at all. One thing I wanted to point out here is that I overlooked that the arms should swing back quicker than I originally animated them, to give them a chance to rise as Zen begins her jump and increase the jump's force. I also fixed this in post, but I wanted to point it out here just in case anyone's trying to use this video to learn something. And again, looking at different references for what a jump from a crouching position looks like would help avoid this problem. The same jumping physics apply to her as they did with Rai, and her arms swing up into the air during her ascent. There's another small cut here, partly because I added Zen's sword and sheath that are just attached to her body, but also because the Stick Nodes 4.2.0 update had just dropped at the time of recording. I didn't use any of the new features for the rest of the time lapse, but it explains the slight change to the UI if anybody noticed that. As Zen comes down, she sheaths her sword and crouches to end off her jump. She starts to stand up as Rai's already in the air, and she manages to narrowly avoid his kick that I spaced out with the little black guideline I left earlier. Her final action for the time lapse is going to be blocking the next kick Rai's already set up. She raises her right arm, and even though she does get there in time, since the kick has a lot of momentum behind it, it's going to push past her block and stagger her for a bit. I didn't do it here, but if you want to make a block look more believably sturdy, you could either have the offhand place on the upper arm of the one that's blocking, or just have your character block with two arms. I removed Zen's head stick just to animate the turn of her body a little bit easier, but I add it back in the second and I have her reel from the kick just to show the weight it had behind it. Alright, now with all of that out of the way, I'm going to go ahead and close the time lapse off here and get into showing you guys the results. If you made it this far, I hope you guys found the video either entertaining or found something that you could learn from it. And again, leave a like or a comment to let me know if you want more time lapses like this, or if you prefer them the way I have them with no commentary instead.